you.
Thank you. Thank you for this very kind introduction and also for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here and to meet this very vibrant and rich scientific community. It's my first time, so thanks for coming to listen to my talk today. All right. Okay. What is vision for? That's the broad question that I'm going to ask today, but that's also the question at the heart of vision science. Vision science is the scientific investigation of visual perception, so the way we perceive the things in the visual world. And for many decades, this is one of the most developed fields in cognitive neuroscience. But for many decades, this research field has been concerned with the perception of stimuli such as contrast, luminance, lines, dots, what generally we call a low-level vision, until the field was faced with the evidence that visual perception and the visual cortex holds representations that are higher level than initially thought. For instance, representation of full objects. Even more, one principle of organization of object-related information is this distinction, this broad distinction between animate and inanimate objects. This is an illustration of the visual system of the visual cortex here highlighted in the colorful parts, and in green you see the areas that respond preferentially, are more important to recognize inanimate objects, tools, buildings, anything that is inanimate. And in pink you see the areas that are more important to recognize animate objects, animals. Even more, we now know that the visual cortex hosts a set of regions that are highly tuned or specialized for the perception of certain classes of objects, such as faces, bodies and body parts, biological motion. All these features that are typical, if not diagnostic, of animate things or animals. So all these discoveries in the past decades have significantly widened the taxonomy of visual functions and have inspired this new research field, relatively new research field that sometimes is called the science of social vision, that uses the tools and the methods of vision science to understand the social function of vision. So the underlying idea here is that there are specialized mechanisms and neural structures to detect, recognize, and identify animals or animate objects, of course, because of the behavioral and evolutionary relevance of these objects for the survival of the individuals and the species more generally. However, the natural habitat of humans is not just the animal kingdom, but is the social world. And in the social world, the relevant entities are not just animals or animate things, are social beings, social entities. Thus, the human life and the very human nature requires more than the ability to distinguish just between animate and inanimate things. It requires the ability to distinguish between social and non-social entities. So the question that I'm going to raise today is that can vision do it? Can vision distinguish between social and non-social entities? So in this talk, I will show a number, of course, I will provide an affirmative answer to this question because otherwise I wouldn't be here. I will show a number of behavioral and neural phenomena to support this affirmation. And if I have time at the end, I will try to draw a link between these visual functions, the visual functions that I'm going to illustrate, and social life or human sociality more generally. Okay, so first of all, what is a social? What is a social being? So in many definitions, social beings are characterized by gregariousness, mutual influence, prosociality, adaptation to group living, alignment with others, need to belong to relationships and groups, need to share experiences of attention and emotion, and perhaps other characterization. Now, leaving aside the differences between this definition, all these characterizations have in common the idea that a social being is an agent that engages with another agent, whose body, attention, or action is directed to another. In other words, a social being is an agent in a social interaction. Now, this psychological feature of social engagement in the visual world is signaled by a number of reliable cues. For instance, interacting people typically are close in space and face-to-face. So this feature that we call facingness is a very particular spatial configuration that it basically allows the mutual perceptual accessibility of two or more agents. And this spatial configuration allows, for instance, for basic social behaviors such as gaze following, shared attention, mind reading, reading of emotions. And perhaps because of this, most likely because of this, it's a spatial positioning that it's very common in physical and communicative exchanges. So the question that I'm going to address is whether the visual system can leverage this kind of visual spatial cues to distinguish between socially engaged and non-socially engaged individuals. Okay, so in the first of these studies, we ask whether there is a special visual sensitivity to this configuration, to this object that is in fact an object that encompasses two different objects in this face-to-face configuration. So the question is whether the visual system processes more efficiently these two bodies relative to the very same bodies presented back to back. So the gold standard of visual efficiency is face perception. We know that faces are detected, recognized, and identified better than any other familiar object. And this is because the idea is that we access the face as a whole, so we skip the part-by-part analysis that characterize object perception. And of course, this affords an advantage in the processing, but this has also a cost. For instance, if we break the canonical relationships between the parts of a face, as in the case of inversion, where now the eyes are below the nose and the nose is below the mouth, we have a huge cost in perception, in face perception, which is disproportionately higher than the cost that we obtain for any other object that is processed with this part-by-part analysis. Now, the literature on inversion effects and configural processing is very rich. There are still some controversies in the field, but and this is true also for bodies, sorry. But of course, for the sake of this talk, keep in mind that the inversion effect, so the magnitude of this difference, tends to be the highest for stimuli that are processed with particular efficiency by the visual system. So typically, and so this is why reportedly the inversion effect is the highest for faces, but also for bodies, that are those objects that the visual system seems to prefer, to like more than other objects, as we saw in the intro. Okay, now, with this background, let's go back to our question of whether there is a higher visual sensitivity to this configuration of bodies relative to these other non-facing configuration of bodies. We call these facing and non-facing dyads. So to test this, we designed a new paradigm in which we presented bodies face-to-face or back-to-back, upright or inverted, because we wanted to measure the inversion effect, interleaved with other pairs of objects such as chairs, face-to-face, back-to-back, upright or inverted. And this is how the paradigm looked like. The stimuli were flashed quite rapidly and then masked. This is a way to isolate the early stages of visual perception. And this is how the resolution is not ideal, but it gives you like a general idea of the task. So we flash the stimuli quite rapidly, we mask them, and the subject had just to report whether they have seen for each trial body, chairs, or plants in this case, regardless of the number, the orientation, face-to-face, back-to-back, configuration, upright, inverted. The subject just had to do a basic level categorization task. It's interesting because they always complain, they don't see anything, it's too fast. But in fact, you will see that they perform very well. And this is what we found exactly in the first of these studies. We found that there was a reliable advantage in detecting facing bodies relative to the very same bodies presented back to back. And perhaps even more intriguingly, there was a significantly larger inversion effect for facing bodies relative to non-facing bodies. And this is exactly the pattern that we find when we compare perception of faces, our preferred stimuli, with the perception of another class of familiar objects. So given the paradigm, we can say, we can argue that this effect emerged very rapidly, automatically. As I said, the subjects are not instructed to attend to the positioning of the bodies. And in fact, it's interesting because in the debriefing, typically we ask the subjects whether they have noted anything about the experiment, and they almost never reported the facing, non-facing manipulation. They don't seem to be aware of it. They talk about, bodies upright, inverted, the chairs, but they don't seem to be aware that that's the key manipulation. And still we found this effect. So this phenomenon that looks like appears to be rapid, automatic, implicit, has a lot of the features that suggest that it's a raising in perception, or at least before a more elaborated inferential processing of the stimuli. So we went down this path and wanted to see whether we could relate this behavioral effect to the activity in the visual cortex. So here it's in another study where we recruited a new group of subjects, and they performed the same task that you just saw. So they had to do the visual categorization task, and we replicated the two-body inversion effect, which is, if you remember, is the larger inversion effect for facing relative to non-facing bodies. And now this effect has been replicated many times in many different labs and settings. So it's a very reliable phenomenon. And in this study, we called the same subjects back for a second visit. They repeated the same task. We replicated the same effect. And we also found that there was a high test-retest reliability, meaning that this is an easy to replicate, stable over time indicator of how an individual deals with this kind of task. All right, so we found that we could replicate this effect over time, and so we called the same subjects back for a third visit. This time they took part in an fMRI session, so they lied in the scanner, and they just saw facing and non-facing bodies, upright or inverted. There was no task. We just wanted to measure the neural responses to these stimuli. In fact, we wanted to see where in the brain activity predicted best this behavioral effect. So how we did it, so for each voxel across the whole brain that responded to bodies more than to the baseline, we computed the neural two-body inversion effect. So exactly the same measure, but in terms of neural activity. So the difference in terms of neural activity between upright and inverted facing bodies subtracted from the difference to the difference in neural activity between upright and inverted and non-facing bodies. So these are exactly the same measures. One is in terms of accuracy and the other one is in terms of neural activity. And then we run a correlation between the individual behavioral pattern and each voxel, this measure in each voxel that responded to bodies. And what we observed was that the strongest correlation was found in this part of the brain, which happens to be the visual cortex, and interestingly, fairly overlap with the extrastriate cortex that has been known for many years to be particularly important for the recognition of bodies, body parts, and processing of the relations between body parts to give rise to the structure of a body. So it's a region that was known to be involved in body perception. So now, in a number of different studies, we have found a similar effect. You see this activity here across different studies where we use different tasks or different settings. And we found this effect just by using by running the univariate contrast between facing and non-facing bodies. So we just subtracted the activity on non-facing bodies to the activity associated with the facing dyads. And the fact that we find this univariate effect, it's interesting because it suggests that the visual system, the visual cortex is not just discriminating between these two stimuli, but it's responding more to the facing dyads, to the facing bodies, as if there is something more that is encoding, perhaps some emergent properties that results from the spatial positioning of these two bodies. Encouraged by this observation, in another study, we also ask whether the representation of a body, of a single body, changes in the visual cortex, depending on whether the body is perceived in a facing dyad or in a non-facing dyad. So in this study, subjects saw our facing and non-facing dyads, and also each individual body posture involved in the facing dyads. So what we did was, for each individual body posture, we extract from different aspects of the visual cortex the neural patterns of activity that define the response to each single body, the unique response to each single body. And then we train a linear classifier to discriminate between these neural patterns, so to discriminate between the responses to these bodies. And then we tested the classifier on the discrimination when the bodies were presented in facing dyads and when the bodies were presented in non-facing dyads. And what we found was that selectively in the EBA, around the EBA, we found a significant increase. We found that the discrimination, so the representation of a body, was significantly better when the body was seen in a facing dyad than when the very same body appeared in a non-facing dyad. Now, from a vision perspective, there is absolutely no reason to expect these differences in terms of overall neural activity or neural patterns of activity discrimination between these two stimuli that are exactly the same object, is exactly the same object, the same number of pixels, the same luminance, contrast, the same body posture. In theory, from what we know about the visual system, it shouldn't care about the distinction between these two. It shouldn't show a distinction between these two objects unless what is representing in something more than just two bodies. It's representing the relations between the two bodies, or what we believe it is the distinction between social and non-social entities. So objects that carries those signal of social engagement versus objects that lack those relational cues. Sure. No. No, sorry, that was collapsed. So sometimes this appeared here, sometimes it appeared here. So this is the decoding, the pattern collapse across the different spatial positionings of the bodies. Yes. So we had all possible combinations. So it could be on the left, on the right. Right. Yes. Yes, that was collapsed. That was like average and gave rise to one single neural pattern. Okay, so in the next part, I'm going to ask how this phenomenon of facingness perception, so this new representation of seemingly related or interacting people relates to other effects, phenomena that we have known for many years in social perception. So if you remember from my introduction, I mentioned that we have known now for a few decades that the visual cortex holds these hotspots, representational clusters dedicated to face perception, to body perception, to biological motion perception. So the question is how now this new visual object that the visual system seems to like more than others, visually matched object relates to this phenomena in visual in social perception. So in this study that was led by a brilliant young PhD student, Violette Munon, we included a number of tasks that have been shown to trigger the neural selectivity in the visual cortex. So we have our facing and non-facing dyads, this time in their animated version. So these are point-light displays of two bodies facing and moving toward each other, and the very same bodies moving and facing away from each other. And of course, like here, we took care of matching the distance, the motion energy. So what really remains when we contrast these two stimuli is the positioning, face-to-face or back-to-back. We also included another set that has been shown to increase the activity in the visual cortex. Here, they look very similar, but in fact, here are point-light displays that represent fully fledged, meaningful social interactions between the two individuals, and are typically contrasted with videos depicting two individuals acting independently. Then we also had this classic task where a subject saw dynamic faces and dynamic toys. And finally, we included this task that also increases activity in various sectors of the visual cortex, where we show human movements, like an individual performing various movements, contrasted with scrambled versions of these point-light displays, where the low level and the local motion remains the same, but we sort of break the body action representation. So when we run this, here you see just the raw data basically. So this is the results when we run each individual contrast. So each social stimulus contrasted with its corresponding control stimuli. What you can see here is that the red areas that indicates the peak of activities in this contrast always involve, for every contrast, involve this occipitotemporal lateral activity with sort of a hot spot here around the posterior superior temporal sulcus. So this is just a rough contrast between all social stimuli and all non-social stimuli. It's not carefully done, but it's just to see that, social stimuli tend to recruit this lateral occipitotemporal cortex more than their visually matched controls. Now, the first question that we ask in this study is whether these are there is just one type of neurons, a type of neuronal population that likes the social, all like stimuli that have a social content that have to do with bodies and faces, or we can actually dissociate between the effects of these stimuli. And what we did here was to isolate the voxels that shows the highest selectivity to each type of social stimulus. So in different colors, you see the voxels that shows the highest selectivity to facing dyads, to social interactions, to faces, and to bodies. And as you can see, you can clearly distinguish all four colors. And the overlap, it's very modest. It's in these black areas. Actually, this effect make most sense to be seen in individual subjects. So for each individual subject, we actually find that, we can segregate the voxels that show a certain type of selectivity to a certain type of stimulus, and we quantify the spatial overlap in terms of Dice coefficient, which is just one measure to isolate, to measure the spatial overlap, and in fact it turned out to be relatively low. Moreover, we found that generally there was no correlation between different types of selectivity. I'm not going to go into the details of this plot because it becomes too technical and perhaps boring, but the bottom line is that basically what we found is that if a given voxel, for instance, was particularly highly selective to faces, it was not necessarily highly selective to interactions, facingness, and body perception. So the degree of selectivity, of different types of selectivity to the different types of stimuli was quite independent. So there was a very low correlation. So, okay, now we are left with this series of areas along this path that looks like a stream. But if you know anything about the visual system, you probably know from textbook that there are two streams in the visual cortex. A ventral stream here in pink that is known to be the most important machinery for object recognition, and a dorsal stream here that is known to be more important for object location or for encoding information about, how to reach and interact with objects. And this stream doesn't seem to belong to either. We are not the first to suggest that there might be other meaningful divisions of the visual system, particularly divisions dedicated to social perception. This is perhaps one of the most famous papers that has been, but there are other authors who have, come up with similar proposals. This is the paper by Pitcher and Unger-Leiders, who put together all the literature about mostly face perception and suggested that there might be another stream in the visual cortex, that is another pathway in the visual cortex that is dedicated to perceiving faces. What our results add to this literature is that this really looks like a stream more than a pathway. And a stream is the definition of a stream is a set of pathways or different branches that have a common origin, perhaps in the early visual cortex, and run in parallel and quite independently of each other, although they can share information processing, they can even share functional profiles. And the idea is that they are organized around a common goal that in this case can be the social interaction, the goal of processing information from the visual environment that is relevant to social interact with the environment. So that's the working hypothesis. Now, of course, this is like a cartoon model. Here we actually combine together all the anatomical and functional data that we have about the dorsal, the ventral, and now also this third lateral stream. And you see that there is no overlap beyond the early visual cortex between these three streams. And also we tested whether, like along each stream, so for each sector along the three streams, we test the responses to these social stimuli, to our 4 classes of social stimuli. And as you can see, of course, given the data that I presented before, You see, this is from the posterior to the anterior part of the stream here. Here, you see this emerging neural selectivity for all 4 classes of stimuli, and we found nothing like that, so no selectivity in any aspect of the other 2 streams. Of course, this doesn't mean that the ventral and dorsal stream don't carry information or don't respond to social stimuli. Probably there is a lot of important information at this process there. But what I'm saying is that they don't show the selectivity to these stimuli, which is the design feature of the visual cortex for efficient categorization, for efficient recognition of the stimuli. We have now a number of, it's a huge literature in vision and computational neuroscience that shows that selectivity, neural selectivity, so this increased activity for certain classes of stimuli, increases the tolerance to invariance, to variations across a range of features such as luminance, contrast, orientation, and so on. So it improves the ability of a given region to generalize across different exemplars of visually similar objects, but also it improves the category it increases the category boundaries. So it makes 2 classes of object easier to discriminate. Okay, so this research overall is suggesting, or is going in the direction of suggesting, that there is a stream for processing visual information that is organized around the downstream goal for social interaction. So it's encoding a number of different cues, faces, coming from faces, bodies, motion, relations between individuals. And then, of course, it would be interesting to go beyond the visual cortex and see where this stream is heading to and how this information is integrated. Okay, so in the last part of my talk, I'm going to, so of course, the idea of all this, I even said it, is that this is relevant for social behavior, maybe even for social cognition. But this is a very big jump, like going from this visual phenomena to the human social nature or human social cognition. Of course, there is a big gap to fill. But this is how we've been thinking about this and how we've been going about this issue. So this is our reasoning. If the advantage for facing dyads that we see in visual perception has anything to do with broadly with the social abilities or social skills, we should find that this advantage is altered is in individuals with impaired social skills. And it's a common feature of social minds and brains. So to test the first prediction, we took a quasi-neuropsychological approach. Let me introduce the last paradigm for today, so I hope you're not too tired. So we have shown, like I hope I convinced you that the visual system likes this stimulus more than these other stimulus. Now, the prediction from this increased visual sensitivity for facing dyads is that the facing dyads should be more likely to capture our attention. And in fact, we show this in a number of visual search studies. In visual search, subjects are instructed to look for a target in an array of objects. So what we did here, we asked in one condition to the subject to look for the only facing dyad in an array of non-facing dyads used as distractors. In the other condition, they had to look for the only non-facing dyad in an array of facing dyads used as distractors. And what we found is typically subjects have an advantage in detecting the facing dyads. So the task is very difficult, like we flashed the arrays very rapidly, and the subject have to report whether the target was at the left or right of the central fixation cross. And across a number of studies, we replicated this advantage in finding the facing dyad. including in this new study. You see this advantage here. Subjects are better at finding the facing diets than the non-facing diets. In this study, we also had the chance to test a group of high-functioning individuals with autism spectrum disorder. So, as you might know, autism spectrum disorder is characterized by persistent deficit in social communication and interaction associated with restricted and repetitive behaviors. So the subjects were tested on the visual search task, and what we found was that there was no advantage for facing diets. So this group didn't show the same advantage that we have found in many different groups of neurotypical subjects. This is interesting also because we have studied this phenomenon quite in depth in a number of studies, and it seems to be very pre-attentive, like this attentional capture by the facing diets occur in an automatic way, like subjects don't necessarily need to do serial search through the array, but they spontaneously direct their attention to where the facing diet is. So it's a very implicit, again, phenomenon. So we didn't ask, it doesn't require the subject to be aware of the social content, to be aware of the social relation, which is something that may put the individuals with autism in an uncomfortable position. But still, it's a very unspecific difference because, one may say, okay, maybe people with autism have a general problem with visual search or have a general problem in processing relations between objects and has nothing to do with social perception. So to address this kind of questions, we designed a different version of this task. So here we replace the pairs of objects with the pairs of bodies with the pairs of objects, and we had two different types of pairs. In one pair, objects were related, which means that they appeared in the regular configuration for as we normally experience them or as we normally use them in the real world. And in the other condition, they appeared in the as unrelated objects. So we broke the regular configuration. And we created this kind of arrays, really like in the previous task. In one condition, the subject had to look for the only related pair in an array of unrelated pairs. And in the other condition, they had to look for the only unrelated pair in an array of related pairs. And as we have replicated in many different studies, in this task, subjects have an advantage in detecting the unrelated pair. So they, for some reason, probably because it breaks or it violates the expectation of how we typically experience this object in the environment, we often find this advantage for the unrelated pair. And we find exactly the same pattern in the individual with autism. And this is actually a three-way interaction between the group, the category, objects or bodies, and the relationship, related or unrelated, which depicts a beautiful double dissociation where individuals with autism manifest a specific absence of the attentional advantage for facing diets, which cannot be associated with a general problem with attention, a general difference in visual search, or more broadly, a problem in encoding relations between any objects. The second prediction of our reasoning was that if the advantage for facing diets has anything to do with social abilities in general, it should be a common feature of social minds, of species that are characterized by gregariousness. So to test this prediction, we simplified the visual search task. In fact, we turn it into a simple preferential look-in time paradigm. So in this task, typically you present two different stimuli, the two sides of the screen, and use eye tracking to measure where spontaneously the subject look longer. So this is not the most sensitive task that one can think of, especially with healthy adults. But we still found that adults spontaneously look longer at facing diets relative to non-facing diets. We replicated this in children, even in toddlers, tested with eye tracking. And then we had the chance to test a group of macaque monkeys, juvenile macaque monkeys, where the only difference was that we replaced the human bodies with the macaque bodies. And as you see here, we found the same preference for facing relative to non-facing bodies. Now, more recently, we had the chance to test the same behavior in another species, the chicks, which is interesting because it's relatively easy to test at birth. So in this study that was run at the University of Trento with Professor Giorgio Vallortigara, they have this interesting setting where there is a platform, and we put an egg that is about to hatch on the platform, and then at the two sides of the platform, we show two different stimuli. In this case, we have two facing hands and two non-facing hands. And then we waited for the egg to hatch, and then we measure where the chicks spontaneously go. What we found was that, so the positive value here indicates a preference for facing diets, and we see that the chicks spontaneously went toward the facing diets. But this was only found in the female chicks. This is the behavior over time, over 30 minutes of time. You see that the female chicks immediately go toward the facing diets and spend most part of the time, over 30 minutes, around the same areas, and we found no preference in the male chicks. This is very interesting because chicks are what it's called a strictly polygynous species. So they are organized in society with one male rooster who is very solitary and territorial. And it has been shown in a rich literature that it has a very poor sensitivity or interest in a social interaction, and many hierarchically organized females who are typically more socially prone. So for our theory, the fact that we found this sex difference in this population, it's interesting because male and female chicks have exactly the same visual system. So it means that this preference for facing diets doesn't have anything to do with some low-level perceptual aspect of the stimuli, but it's really related to the biological meaning of these stimuli. So, to wrap up this part, what I've shown so far is that the visual advantage for facing diets is present in other socially gregarious species besides humans, and is not found in non-social individuals. In particular, in this case, we tested the male chicks, and in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. All right, so some concluding remarks. So I started this presentation with this big question of what is vision for? And in fact, a reasonable answer to this question was provided already by Marr in the 80s, who famously argued that vision is to know what is where by looking. So vision is about objects in spatial locations. What this research is showing is that beyond objects and locations, we see meaningful relations or interactions between objects. And this is really inspiring a new field of research that is exploring the function of vision in unraveling the causal and social structure of the world. This research is also revealing new representational clusters in the visual cortex that, as I suggest, might be part of this third lateral stream that appears to be uniquely selective to social stimuli, hosting separate pathways that might be possibly organized around a common downstream goal that is supporting social interaction. In sum, this work extends the boundaries of visual perception to include a complex compositional representation of scenes that might reveal the early stages of social cognition and might be broadly available across animal species, as we saw, so they can account for maybe for the origin of social cognition in animals as well, and also in human development. And with this, I stop here, and I thank the co-authors of this research, which are mostly people from my lab in Lione, and I thank you for the attention.